Are the Redwall books Mattimeo and Mossflower still good? This is a question that I have as I'm going through these books with my son, because I'm a dad who's trying to create meaningful experiences with his kids through reading with them. And so I'm going to go through and give you my take on finishing Mattimeo and Mossflower. I'm going to tell you the things that are good, the things that are worse, and I'm going to talk about which order I think you should read these books in, because there's a kind of a confusing order about them. Let me start off with just the best thing about these books. It is the world building. If you're unfamiliar with the term world building, what that refers to is the process of creating a larger universe or world that this story takes place in. So an example that would not be world building would be something like Nancy Drew books or Hardy Boys books. Those books, they take place in our world, so there's not much really of the context of what's going on in that world, but each book just kind of deals with the plot. It deals with the mystery at hand, and it's not trying to build out more of the world that the detectives live in. A good example of world building would be Harry Potter, though it's not the best. It's not like Harry Potter is known for its world building, but at the beginning, you get to go into Diagon Alley and then to Hogwarts, and you get those two areas of Harry Potter, and you're starting to learn about the wizarding world. In the second book, in Chamber of Secrets, you get introduced to Nocturne Alley, right? You start to learn that there's another place within this world. In the third book, Harry gets to live in Diagon Alley, and you get to get a little bit more of Hogsmeade, what's going on around Hogwarts, right? And with each book, you're building out the world a little bit more so people understand that Harry Potter is not just a character who lives at Hogwarts. Harry Potter is a character who lives in an entire wizarding world, and there are a lot of really interesting things occurring in that world. That's the best part of these Redwall books, is that the first Redwall took place almost solely at Redwall. Now, of course, there's like the church down the road, and then there's the quarry, but that's all within a pretty tight neighborhood. With Mattimeo, you follow the same characters from Redwall out into the world, and you get to learn about Loamhedge, which is where the mice used to be before they came to Redwall. And then in Mossflower, you get to learn more about like the origins of Redwall. You get to learn more about Martin the Warrior, this character who inspired Matthias in the first Redwall. So this is some of the fun stuff about these books, is how they build out the world. One of my favorite world building moments outside of these books has been in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So things like in Ant-Man, when Falcon appears and you're like, oh, Ant-Man lives in the same world as the Avengers. Not only are they talking about the Avengers, but he's actually meeting an Avenger. It creates this integrated universe. You realize that there's more to this world than just that story. And you get that feeling when you're coming through these books. So you go through Martin the Warrior story, and they make references to what's coming up. Like, oh, well, let's build Redwall, or let's do this thing. Or you start realizing that there are all these pieces and where they came from. And it's just a really fun part. And my son loved that part. He would pick up on those references and realize, oh, that's where this comes from. Or, oh, we learned about that in the other book. So to have that world building experience with my son, that was a lot of fun. That's the best part, is the world building that goes on. And you keep seeing this through the other Redwall books, which I'm sure I'm going to review. The worst part about these books is that you start to see the pattern arise. There's kind of a storytelling pattern. There's a threat. You start off and there's the initial conflict with the threats. You don't really make too much advancement with it, but you know that it's coming. You know that maybe there's a first battle and there's kind of a stalemate. So then the main character has to go out on a quest, and that quest is going to bring back the solution to fighting this big threat. Well, while that character's on the quest, the people who remain have to deal with their threat. Either it's the same one that was there, or maybe it's a new threat, but they're dealing with their conflict. And then, of course, the hero comes back and just obliterates the enemy. Along with that pattern, you start seeing some of the animals really fit some stereotypes. You know, hares are going to act like hares from other books. Moles are going to act like moles from other books. So you start to get this kind of pattern of storytelling And it kind of takes away the novelty of it. Not for me, or not for my son, I think. I think he's still enjoying it. He hasn't quite picked up on this pattern yet. But I'm definitely noticing that there's a formula to these books. We're on the fourth one, Mariel of Redwall, and I can already see the pattern coming in, and I can see where this is going. And it just kind of gets a little tiring for me as an adult reading it. Like I said, my son, who is 9, still loves it despite the pattern. And the pattern actually creates another bad part about these books. That is, sometimes he's like really trying hard to fit this pattern, especially when he doesn't have to. But like, I think the second worst offender is in Mossflower, when Martin is trapped in a cave and there are bats there, and the bats need some help getting rid of, I think it was an owl or some sort of bird. And there's just nothing from that story that contributes to the rest of it. There's nothing that's like a personal growth. There's no like, hey, it's a good thing we did that because now we can do this. It feels really awkward to come across it. You can compare that to Redwall, when Matthias goes up to the Spara colony and he fails in getting the sword, but by participating in that little side quest, the Sparas then come back at the end of the book to support him in the fight against Clooney the Scourge. That's an important reason for that side quest. Even though it ultimately failed in his objective, it came around that because of what he did, he had an ally for the final battle. That makes sense. With the bats, there was nothing there with that. It really made that story drag on, especially because you're missing a character at that point. It doesn't feel like there's an urgency to see if there's any way to go find him. I just didn't understand why that side quest had happened other than basically fulfilling the pattern that these books follow. That was just the second worst one. The worst one happens in Mattimeo, and that's when Martin and his crew are gone and the people at Redwall are left, and the big bad is not at Redwall. The big bad is off trying to get to Loamhedge, and that's who Martin's trying to chase. So now the characters at Redwall, they don't have anything to do. So this crow, Ironbeak, just comes out of nowhere to try and take over Redwall. And it felt so awkward when that started, because there was no premonition. There was no sign that this was coming. It was just Martin and his crew are gone. Wow, what are these characters going to do? Let's throw a threat at them. And it just feels so forced. And part of the reason that it just ends unsatisfactorily is that the resolution is also forced on. It's like, okay, how are they going to deal with this? Well, let's send them another bird, Strike Red Kite, from just another region. There's absolutely no reason for this bird to be here. Just randomly appears like about a third before the book ends. And that's how they're able to finally chase off Ironbeak and his crew. And it just felt like it was unnatural, that there was no reason for that storyline other than like we needed something for those characters to do, and we needed to keep checking in on them. So I wasn't a big fan of the pattern and the problems it creates for storytelling in terms of like, oh, we have to fill in this pattern. I don't think that pattern needs to exist. There's no reason that these things have to go in a certain pattern. I worry that there's not going to be enough variation in the storytelling as I get further into the books. I worry that it's just going to be like, here's the pattern, let's follow it, let's churn out these books because they're doing well. Another really interesting part of these books is that I'm not quite seeing a transformation in the characters. Like, where do they start and where they end? So if you look at like Martin the Warrior, he starts off in Mossflower as a warrior. He's defying Sarmina. He's very courageous. And he stays courageous throughout the whole thing. There's not a point at the beginning where he feels like he's not up for the challenge. Matthias had that a little, at least. Matthias still was like charging into things the whole time. There wasn't as much transformation. Martin the Warrior didn't feel as much transformation either. Mattimeo has a little bit more, because Mattimeo starts off as kind of this aloof son, somewhat rebellious, doesn't really like his father. He ends up being right about the conflict at the beginning, which I think is interesting, but there's this conflict between father and son, and there's some growth in that relationship over there. So there's a little bit more transformation in the Mattimeo storyline. I did like that it was a father-son story. It felt a little bit more appropriate to read with my son. That was interesting aspect of it, and to be able to relate a little bit more to Matthias in that book, and I'm sure he related a little bit more to Mattimeo in that book. So the transformation, I wish that these characters had better arcs where they were actually experiencing some sort of change that then allowed them to overcome whatever their weakness or their barrier was at the beginning. Usually it ends up being upgrading. So in both Mossflower and Redwall, their transformations are just going to get the sword that they need to fight the big bad. It's kind of like the weapon is supposed to be symbolic of the personal transformation they're going through, but I just don't get as much of that personal transformation in these books generally. Something that's really interesting that I didn't realize as a kid, I'm sure, I definitely did not remember this as I was picking up these books to read them again to my son, is that there is a body count in these books. Like, people are dying all the time. It is a little dark at points too. So there are, like, in Mattimeo, a mother dies and leaves her orphan children. And this mother is not even like someone trying to challenge and fight the big bad. This is just, she happened to be in the way and the bad person killed her. That, like, I was a little hesitant at first as I was reading these, because I was like, oh my goodness, these people are dying, sometimes not even in like sanitized ways. Sometimes it's just like a sword was thrust through them. It's very serious. But I think it's good in some ways because it allows us to have that story of death and try to understand something that's a little bit more serious than like a story that just is like, oh, and then they gave up and they left. Sometimes I worry that we don't have enough of these kind of hard-hitting stories. I think children in the past were probably raised more around death and stories of death than children today. And it makes me wonder if maybe that's a bad thing. I don't know. It's hard for me to tell, but a good thing. So, I'm kind of ambivalent about the body count, but there is a good thing about it. The villains always come out very evil. And now let me explain what that means. It's easy for the author to just describe these characters as like, and this was an evil person, and they were so bad and they were so mean, and just to describe it with words. Instead, what the author does is show us how bad these people are, right? When the fox kills a woman and leaves her children as orphans, like, that's an evil fox. You don't need someone to say this is an evil fox. Through his actions, you have seen this is a bad dude. And you see that with all of the villains in these books. When they are bad, like, they are really bad. And it does a great job at conveying that through their actions rather than just some weak adjectives. So I like that a lot about the books, is that you get more showing and not as much telling. The books are good, and like I said, my 9-year-old son has been loving them. I think the world building aspect of it has helped him a lot, but the question remains, what order should you read these books in? Because Redwall was written first, the second one written was Mossflower, and the third one written was Mattimeo. But in this Marvel cinematic universe, Mossflower is like the Captain America, where even though it was written later, it comes before these books. It's a prequel. And so, so do you read that one second, or when is the right time to read it? I know some people suggest reading that one first, so that way you come into Redwall and you understand some of the things going on there. I think you absolutely have to start with Redwall, just because that is the foundational book, and you're just going to understand a lot more if you start with the foundational book. We read Mattimeo second, and I really think that was the right choice because the characters are mostly the same. So you get the familiarity of the characters, and then they push out on the world, which helps a lot. Because with Mossflower, you're pushing out on both the world and the characters. You have Martin the Warrior, but in Mossflower, you get introduced to Brockhall, you get introduced to Salamandastron, you're getting introduced to so many characters or so many places in the world at the same time as so many characters that it might not be as easy to follow. When you get to Mattimeo, you have the same cast from Redwall, but then you start exploring more places, so it's easier for a child to track everything. And I think they're a little bit more emotionally invested in the characters because they've already seen them in Redwall. You can create meaningful memories with your children as you read with them. I really want to encourage you as a father to take the time to read with your kids. If you're interested in looking for more book recommendations, definitely check out these videos up here and be sure to subscribe. We will see you next time.